Hi there, well this is a different video from usual because I've had somebody who watches this channel send a few questions for me to answer. So I'm going to have a rough go at these questions, and a person can contact me if they want to and ask a bit more. You might hear noises off because the dog's in here but out of shot.
Oi.
There you are, on cue. Yes, hello boy. So here goes. If this is any good, then maybe if anybody else wants to send in questions, might try and fit in the odd other video. So, first question. What would happen to me during the revelation of John, and where would I go? Right, I think we need to begin by clearing up some misunderstandings about the revelation of John. So, the book of Revelation is a very technical kind of literature. It's what's called apocalyptic. Now, the trouble with hearing that word apocalyptic in English is that you immediately think of things like the end of the world and cataclysmic disasters and stuff like that. But apocalyptic actually was a technical term for a certain kind of language, and Jewish people practiced this. It was almost like a code language, you might say. What it was using very vivid graphic imagery in the language to communicate messages to one another, often when those people were under persecution, so that their oppressors didn't understand what they were talking about. Now, that would make perfect sense for the context of the book of Revelation. It's almost certainly written around about AD 95, when one of the periodic phases of persecution of the early Christians was happening under the Roman Emperor Domitian. So, facing these trials and troubles, they needed a sense of hope. You know, they were being rounded up, they were being persecuted, some were being tortured, some were being executed, and so on. And they had this way. Think of the way today that some people use secure channels to communicate digitally, and maybe use something like Telegram rather than text messaging, or that they go on the dark web or something like that. So the book of Revelation functions as this message in this vivid code to give them a sense of hope. It's therefore not all about the end of the world. Some of it towards the end is, but you can't interpret it in detail because you've got to think of it as like a painting with broad brushstrokes rather than a painting done with fine detail. So different theories about Christian understandings of the end of the world, you end up pushing the language and the literature too far. Basically, that book is there to communicate a sense of hope to suffering Christians. It does go on, yes, at the end, to talk about God conquering evil and bringing in the fullness of his kingdom, everything being put right at the end of time, and so on. But those sort of Christians who pursue it for very elaborate theories about what's going on are, I think, deeply mistaken. So some of the stuff that you get from some of the American fundamentalists, like the Left Behind novels, which also misinterpret some of the teaching of Jesus about the end of the world, are also wrong. And if you want to know about the Left Behind stuff, my regular video this Sunday by coincidence, will be tackling one of the passages that they use. So, that said, that probably doesn't still get to the question about what would happen to me, where would I go, where would I be. I've left that out because I kind of want to build that into your second question. And the second question is this: could I redeem myself if I turned out to be really bad? So, this one brings us right to the crux of Christian salvation. Could I redeem myself? No, because nobody can redeem themselves according to Christianity. And that doesn't matter whether we're really bad or whether we're broadly fairly good people but who still drop a few clangers. None of us can redeem ourselves. The whole sense of Christianity is that we all, to some extent, have failed. We all need redeeming, but it's beyond our power. But, I know I keep using that word, that's where the good news of Jesus comes in. Because the Christian message is that Jesus redeems us. That Jesus, regardless of how awful we are, redeems us. There's a verse in Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 5, where it says, while we were still sinners, God saved us. So God sets out in love to people who have messed up, who have hurt him, and still gives up his Son, who comes and who shows us a better way to live, but also dies on the cross so that we can be forgiven and so that we can have a new start. And think of it a bit, I said something like this in last Sunday's video. Think of the cross a bit like the bumper on a car that takes the force of the collision rather than the driver and the passengers. And so Jesus standing in our place, in the way for us of what would come our way, because we are sinners, failures, that makes it possible for us to be redeemed. And again, however bad or what, I was talking last Sunday about Jesus on the cross and how one of the two criminals who was being executed with him said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And there, even on the cross, this criminal, I guess we'd probably think that criminals are usually really bad people. That criminal is redeemed. Not of his own acts, but by Jesus. And so this is offered to us by God, freely offered to us. God takes the initiative. He loves us before we ever do anything for him. And what it calls for from us is not to do anything of our own that makes us right with him, but as it were to hold out empty hands and say, I receive your gift. And that's faith. To trust that by holding out our empty hands, God will give us the love he promises, and he will forgive us. He will give us a new start. Even when we continue to mess up, we can still come back and always be forgiven and have new starts. And then he gives us his Spirit to help us to live differently. So, can I redeem myself? No. But can Jesus redeem us? Absolutely. And then thirdly, we've got a couple of questions about Methodism, seeing as I'm a Methodist minister. although I really only like to think of Methodism as one flavour of Christianity. What's the difference between Methodism and other forms of Christianity? And why don't Methodists do confessionals like Roman Catholics? Okay, I hope you're up for a bit of history. So back in the 18th century in England, when the main church, the Church of England, was fairly moribund and lifeless, when a lot of them had become less theists and more deists, and I'll explain that in a second. A deist is someone who believes in God, but believes that God just created things and then walked away, as it were, and has nothing to do with God's creation. A theist believes in God, but a Christian theist believes that God is still very involved with that creation. So the deist view really is a heresy from a Christian perspective, and it really discourages active faith. And in the middle of that, there was the Wesley family living in a place called Epworth in Lincolnshire. Two of the sons were called John and Charles. They both went to Oxford University and were the sons of an Anglican clergyman, actually. And they went and tried to live out the Christian faith. They tried to live it out methodically, with a method, with a plan, which is where the name Methodist came from, because it was originally a pejorative nickname by those who despised them. But the more, particularly John, tried just to do all the good things of Christianity, the more he tried, the more he failed, and the more frustrated he became. He even, in his efforts to do good things for God, became a missionary. And because we're still talking about the first half of the 18th century, this is a time when America was still a British colony. And John Wesley went over to America, particularly to the state of Georgia, to try and become a missionary. And he was a complete failure. Not only that, he got into a relationship with a woman and basically messed up his love life. So he was a complete and utter mess, spiritually and emotionally. And he said, I went to Georgia to convert the Indians, but oh, who will convert me? Well, he's coming back on a ship across the Atlantic, and this massive storm hits, and that it was so serious that there was a real thought that the ship could capsize and that all the passengers would drown, and he fears for his life. But also on that ship are some Moravian Christians. Now, the Moravians originated in a part of, now, is it the Czech Republic or Slovakia now? Linked in a lot to German Lutheran Christianity, but they were so at peace and not worried about what would happen to them if they died. They were still happily singing hymns and all that, that Wesley realised that these people had something spiritually that he didn't have. And he comes back to London, and on one day, it was the 24th of May 1738, 3 days before this, his younger brother Charles has had an amazing experience of a kind of conversion to a living, vibrant Christianity. And on the 24th, John has gone along to St Paul's Cathedral in the morning and heard a psalm being sung that strikes him. And then in the evening, he goes along to a meeting of Moravian Christians in a place called Aldersgate Street, which is now roughly in the area of the Barbican, if you know London. And he goes into this meeting, and somebody there is reading the preface to Martin Luther's commentary on Paul's letter to the Romans. So this is like some academic book, and somebody is reading what Luther is saying in Introduction to Romans. And just as he's listening to this person reading this out, Wesley has an amazing spiritual experience. He says in his journal, "I felt my heart strangely warmed, and I realised I did trust in Christ alone, for salvation." And at this point, as he puts it later in his life, he changed from having the faith of a servant to the faith of a son. That he wasn't just someone who thought you could do it by following orders. That he realised it was all about how amazingly his Heavenly Father loved him. So that's the massive transformation that happens in John Wesley's life. He gets excited about it, and in April of the following year, in 1739, he gets challenged by another preacher, a man called George Whitfield, to preach outdoors to some miners at a place called Kingswood between Bath and Bristol. Now, that horrifies Wesley as an Anglican clergyman, because he understood that the only place you could preach was in a church building. But Wesley said, no, there are all these people, they're not going to come inside a church door. Go and preach to them there. They need to hear about God's love. And in this real turn of phrase in his journal, he says, I submitted to be more vile. And he goes, and he preaches to these miners, and he sees loads of them find faith in Jesus as he preaches. And from that moment, Wesley starts preaching outdoors wherever he can, and he starts to see many, many people converted. Sometimes the local Church of England welcomes him, sometimes they hate what he's doing. But these groups of converts build up, and he rides on his horse all around the country. He goes down to Cornwall. He, as I say, goes to Bristol. He goes up to Newcastle and all sorts of places. They reckon during his life he probably did about 250,000 miles on his horse. So what happens with these converts? Well, he tells them faithfully to go along to the parish church on Sundays, but he knows that's not going to be enough for them, and so he organises them into small groups in the week, and he sends other preachers round to speak to them and encourage them and run small groups and so on. And those small midweek groups he called societies, and when a little while after his death in 1791, this Methodist movement split from the Church of England and became a separate denomination, those societies became the first Methodist churches. And even some of the structures Wesley put in place then, we still have. In the preachers who used to encourage these little groups used to ride around a circuit of them in an area. And even now, Methodist churches are organised in circuits. But maybe what's really important in all this is what were the core things that Wesley was teaching. And classically, they've been summed up in 4 statements beginning with the word all, the 4 alls of Methodism. And they, I can remember, make sure that I know. The first is all need to be saved. We're all sinners. We all need the love of God and forgiveness. The second was all can be saved. Absolutely anyone can know the love of God and follow Jesus. And there was an importance in that time of all can be saved, because a number of other people followed the teaching of John Calvin that not all people could be saved, only those God had already chosen before time could be saved. Even George Whitefield, who I mentioned earlier, believed that. The third all was all can know that they are saved. In other words, you didn't have to be in any doubt that God loved you. And you could know it from the promises of God in the Bible, and you could know it from your own experience in your heart of God's love, just as Wesley experienced his heart being strangely warmed, as he said. And then the last one was all can be saved to the uttermost. Wesley didn't put any limits on how much God could transform a human life in this life. He even believed that some people could be pretty much become perfect, which of course was a controversial belief. But basically, he was optimistic about what God could do in someone's life. So those have been like the core Methodist beliefs from Wesley's time. Other things have flowed from later parts of Methodist history, not least that Methodism's often also been characterised by a real concern for social justice and a real concern for the poor, and some of that came from 19th century Methodism, partly one particular movement that started in Staffordshire called the Primitive Methodists, that really connected with working class people, but also other things. They got involved. If you've ever heard of the Tolpuddle Martyrs, who were early trade unionists, who, for the wickedness of being trade unionists, were sentenced to be deported to Australia. Most of them were Methodists, and they were trade unionists out of a consequence of their faith. So things like that have also flowed historically from us. We still see ourselves, though, simply as one incomplete part of the wider Christian church. We think we've got things to offer the whole church, but we don't think we've got it all. We recognise that other Christian traditions have got other gifts that maybe we need to appreciate. That doesn't answer the other question about why we don't have confessionals. Well, actually, historically, Methodism did encourage people to confess their sins, but they didn't do it in terms of going into like a private box and speaking to a priest. Partly because we don't see ministers as priests, we see all Christians as priests. And partly because in some of the small groups that happened within the early converts, one of the things they used to do was, in the whole group, they used to talk about how they were getting on week by week in their lives, what had gone well for them, where they had failed, and then the whole group together would pray for them and encourage them. So we don't restrict confession to a priest. We think that it's something that all Christians can help one another with. The other slight difference we've got with the Catholics, though, is about the confidentiality thing in the confessional, you may know that if you go and confess your sins to a Catholic priest, they are bound by the laws of their church not to disclose anything you've said to anyone, even the police. Now, if you share something with a Methodist minister like me, I will normally keep the promise of confidentiality, but we, unlike the Catholics, create one or two exemptions for that, and that's basically if a criminal offence is involved, and especially if something like child or sexual abuse is involved. So I hope that all the waffling I've done gives a start to answering the questions. Anybody's free to come back with other questions or comments, and who knows, maybe we'll do it again, but I think for now we'll leave it there. Okay, bye for now.